Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
And welcome to those who are watching the live stream as well. My name is Michael LaRose. I am one of the directors of New Beacon Books. This is New Beacon Books bookshop in London. And we're very proud that we are launching 4 books this evening, as well as having a discussion about USA after the elections. And we have no finer person than Abdul Alkalimat to guide us through the books and the USA after the elections. Let me read out a quick bio. Abdul Alkalimat is an author, activist, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His many titles include Malcolm X for Beginners and The History of Black Studies. He is currently coordinated MX100 in celebration of 100 years of Malcolm X. More importantly to New Beacon and Abdul's contributions are his contributions to our organization over the years, especially during the book fairs, that is the International Book Fairs of Radical Black and Third World Books, from 1982 to 1995, where we not only made connections, but also had a lot of debates and discussions about the politics of Britain, of the Caribbean, and the USA, which has been very important for us in terms of development, as well as making those live connections with real life activity in the world. So, without further ado, please welcome Abdul Alkalimat.
Thank you so very much, Michael. It's really a pleasure to be here and to remember the relationship between John and Sarah, the Book Fair family, the International Black and Third World Book Fair, and really what I learned coming here, as well as what I shared. I remember talking to Michael. We used to drive from London to Manchester and Bradford and had deep conversations, so I'm very much connected to Michael. Also, I see Gus. We did a tour of England on Malcolm X, and I did the same journey with him. And so it's really meaningful to be here. Last time we were in London, Kate and my wife and I, was at the time of the pandemic. And so it's good to be back. Okay, in case anybody here isn't aware, we recently had a presidential election in the United States. And so Trump got elected. But it's important to put this in some context. The idea is that there is this great sort of mandate that he has because of the convergence of the Republicans on the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of the U.S. government. It's important to know that 1/3 of the U.S. electorate did not vote. And of those who did vote, Trump got 49.9% of that. So when you think of the American electorate, you have to think in terms of the thirds. 1/3 was alienated from the electoral process, 1/3 voted for Trump, and 1/3 voted for Harris. So it's a different kind of situation than what the media and others are projecting. And a lot of times people think that the non-voter was really fascist. The reality is that there was a fascist in the candidacy. So if you were a fascist, you had somebody to vote for. But that alienated vote is an interesting aspect of the American situation. In other words, it's a commentary on bourgeois democracy. In the political documents of the United States, there's a phrase called consent of the governed, which is the basis on which the rule exists, the government exists. And so every major segment of the bourgeoisie is well aware of this non-voting sector. It represents potential danger. And so a lot of what goes on is to sort of maintain order. And so that's important to know. Another aspect, of course, is white workers voted more for Trump than not. It's a very interesting aspect of what's going on because this is a long legacy. And I want to explain some of that. But it's also important to note that what we're really talking about in the American electorate is one wing of capital versus another wing of capital. And so while there was a lot of rhetoric of the great polarity that existed prior to the election, note Biden saying we want a peaceful transition of power. So here's one wing of capital handing it over to an alleged fascist wing. But when you look at their policies, particularly on immigration, the same. Or on Palestine, the same. So there's a great convergence of bourgeois interests in these two wings, the Democrats and the Republicans. One might even argue that they represent, one party with two different faces. But putting this into context, we're using the word fascism. And a lot of times people think the word fascism is really a replication of what happened in the past. And that we're suddenly going to see people in brown shirts goose-stepping down the street. What really people are talking about is an authoritarian politics that advance certain interests. And what's happening in the United States, for example, is that the country is becoming black and brown. Every major city is increasingly majority black and brown. This is creating a crisis because of the institutional racism, the racism in the culture. It's the default position of everybody. And it goes back to even the abolitionists who wanted to end slavery. We're not for black people. We're not for equality. They were for getting rid of the problem and of slavery, and they wanted to get people back to Africa. Now some black people want to go back to Africa for a different reason. But the point is that this legacy of racism is so endemic, is so fundamental, that this growing black and brown presence has created a great crisis. Samuel Huntington, who was a political scientist at Harvard, one of the leading political scientists in the country, he's the man who wrote the book, The Clash of Civilization Thesis, which really was about his argument that it's the Muslims that we have to have this war to the nth degree. Then he wrote another book called Who Are We? This was the book that laid the basis for the idea of building a wall to stop people coming from Latin America and Mexico into the United States. And he says in the book, you don't have to worry about black people. We got them, And don't worry about the Catholics. We turn them into Protestants. Don't worry about them. It's these Mexicans and these Latin Americans. They got their own version of Catholicism. They got their language. They're in communication with people back in their home country. They are the threat. So that's the book that lays sort of the theoretical basis for this anti-immigrant situation. So now another issue, of course, is this whole question of states' rights. And so one of the things that Trump is talking about is the movement from federal policy to state policy, turn it over to the states. And of course, what this raises is two things that are important. One is the urban-rural contradiction, because in most states, it's the rural, more conservative votes that tend to dominate in the state legislatures. And therefore, to turn it over to the states really is a way of turning it over to the right wing. And of course, this is a lot of false consciousness because these are poor farmers being taken over by agribusiness, losing ownership of the land. Small towns are really being marginalized. Buses don't run there. Hospitals, clinics are closing. The polarity of quality of life is happening in a very deep way, but this states' rights is a turnover to people who are getting increasingly desperate. The other aspect of states' rights is the legacy of the South. The southern region of the United States still maintains a great legacy from slavery. And remember this, that in the rural area of America, you often go to county fairs, and you have to remember what side of the Civil War you were on, in Illinois anyway. You have to remind people because they're selling Confederate flags and so on, so it's a public thing. So states' rights, and I'll get back to that. Then, of course, in talking about fascism in the United States, this whole question of the billionaire class. There are 1,000 billionaires in the United States. 10 billionaires funded 50% of Trump's campaign. The president of Israel just called Musk to talk about policy. So this is the direct intervention of the capitalist class in running the state. This is not the typical billionaire whose name you've never heard of, who never you see. No. These people are right out front. And what we're really talking about is a polarity that has in their mind collateral damage. That's really the concept of acceptable aspects of this polarity that's going on. And so those are some of the things I think that one has to take into consideration because the U.S. is changing and people are getting desperate. And people are getting so desperate they're prepared to not advance their own class interests. So there's kind of a suicidal thing going on. But I think there's a future of possibility I want to get to. So let me step back for a moment and give you a broader understanding of what just happened. We've had tremendous spontaneous social movements develop without a base in the working class. This is very important. The Black Lives Matter movement was a great upsurge of Black resistance to really the incidents of murder that were going on, whether it's Trayvon Martin or George Floyd or any number of other people, young and old. But these were young people in the main who did not have a history of struggle. And so they were making comments like, "This ain't your grandma's movement," which represented a lack of historical knowledge. They might have had a little bit more respect for grandma if they knew something about that. There was a conference in Philadelphia. A young woman was interviewed and she said, "We don't need to read no books." Well, she was wrong. So Black Lives Matter, but very important resurgence of the Black liberation movement. Then there was the resurgence of the women's movement, the Me Too movement. It was very big and very broad and very deep. In Chicago alone, there were 100,000 women that marched. Again, without the connection to the working class. The students rose up regarding Palestine. Again, no connection to the working class. So we had the Black liberation movement, the women's movement, the student movement. And now we've got the possibility of that connection to the working class. The United Auto Workers, for example, had for a long time this hadn't happened, actually coordinated contract negotiations with the big three auto companies, and were successful. And so now the United Auto Workers have put forward a claim, a call for general strike in 2028. The plan is to bring together as many unions as possible to arrange contract negotiations to converge on May of 2028 and call for a general strike. So we're really talking about from 500,000 to 1 million workers potentially involved, and many other unions are beginning to realign themselves. So the real question then becomes Black Lives Matter, women's movement, the student movement. To what extent are those movements going to make any connection to this rising upsurge of workers? That's really the fundamental issue of the struggle that will be taking place over the next 4 years. Now, I'm involved in an organization called the Southern Workers Assembly. This is important because the South is where Black people are located more than in any other place, any other region of the country. It's also where the backwardness of the slave history has maintained. So every indicator of social development, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's socioeconomic status, etc., the worst conditions are in the South. And when it comes to labor, the South is where what are called the right to work states are located, which means that even if there is a union in an industry or in a plant, workers don't have to join the union, but they get the benefits, and therefore it really is a way of preventing the development of unionization. Also, there are various laws, for example, in many states, in public sector workers cannot unionize. So there are those kinds of issues, and of course, wages are very low. But here's what happened. What happened is there was runaway shops from the north to the south because of the low wages and the way in which they could keep Black and white workers separate, and therefore the unionization was more difficult. But then those shops then ran to Mexico. And so there's that backwardness that happened in the South. But something new is happening today. Today, the electronic vehicle production is being concentrated in the South. And so we think that represents a new level of proletarianization that will raise up new possibilities. In the trade union movement, a lot of the early development was in places like Amazon and Starbucks and those kind of places where young people were working. What we're now talking about are factory jobs. And so the interesting contradiction is, are young people going to make the transition to this older form of proletarianization so there can be the organization of workers that really reflects an earlier period of factory work? And so that's something that we are developing a strategy that has what we're calling workplace committees. And so in the Southern Workers Assembly, we've got about 30 workplace committees so far, and we're developing workers' assemblies. In other words, in a place where we're talking about multiple workplaces coming together to form an assembly. Now, one of the difficulties in this process is that the way the left in the United States has historically developed has been an alienation from the electoral process. When we look at how the right developed from the bottom up. In other words, the struggle around library boards, school boards, city councils, etc. This is where the right developed its base. And so what we're talking about is, to what extent can there be a working class base developed from the bottom up in this period of Trumpism? Now, one of the interesting things about what Trump and them are getting ready to do is cut federal employment. And one of the interesting things about that is it takes us to talk about the Black middle class. Now, the Black middle class has an old alliance with the Democratic Party. The height, of course, was the more recent presidential administration of Obama. But that also put them at odds with the insurgent progressive wing of the Democratic Party that was represented by Bernie Sanders. And so it was the Black middle class, led by Congressman Clyburn in South Carolina, that stopped Bernie Sanders in the campaign that he had in the Democratic primary with Biden. So it was the black middle class that wanted to maintain this relationship that it had historically with the Democratic Party. This then continues with the candidate of Harris, because Harris essentially became the representative of Biden, and that was really the deal. In other words, we won't have a new primary to actually have an election to select the Democratic candidate. You will be chosen as the candidate to the extent that you will represent the same policy of Biden. And that, of course, was the end of Harris's campaign because people were rejecting Biden. So there was no possibility. But if you look at her previous job was being Attorney General of California. So she was the #1 police person in California, implementing the policy of the capitalist state. On the other hand, she represented that sorority element of the middle class, the celebratory aspect of middle class achievement in federal employment. So here's the interesting thing about that. If they, in fact, limit employment at the federal level, it's a direct attack on the black middle class. And so what we're expecting is there's going to be a polarity, and the black middle class is going to rediscover its progressive nature, and therefore will seek unity with trade union movements, with other forces that will fight to protect its class interests. That represents a new opening. So what I'm trying to really say is that in the context of the dark times that we face, we have to look at the dialectics of what's going on and to see the possibility of a new form of united frontism that will develop where people have common interests. And so the question is, what will be the political leadership that will enable that to actually take place? Now, of course, all of this has to be put in the context of the international situation. And the clarity around global economy leads us to be clear that the real contradiction is not the US versus the Soviet Union as the old Cold War was conceived of, but it's really China. And so the question is, how is that going to actually play out? And I think that it's not accurate to say that Trump is just going to be a wild man and create world war. The other point that is developing is this whole technological revolution that is continuing to take place. Now, one of the interesting things about that is that what we're talking about is the end of the demand for labor. And that is a fundamental crisis in the sense that capitalism depends on the exploitation of labor to exist. In other words, one of the interesting things is robots make this stuff, who's going to buy it? Because robots aren't going to buy it, and people aren't working, they're not going to have any money, so they're not going to buy it. So the real problem is not production, it's distribution. And the US capitalists thought that they could have robots make stuff and the Chinese buy it. Now the Chinese have more robots than they do. So it's an interesting moment here. But again, remember I said the electronic vehicle plants are being built. What we're talking about here is a new factory in a town that has 5,000 to 10,000 jobs, working class jobs. That's going to transform the South. And we're looking for that to be the basis on which there could be real resistance, because many of the people who were alienated, who voted for Trump, are now going to find that their lives are attacked by Trump's policies. And this new development of the working class gives new opportunities. But we've got all kinds of, what I'm talking about are objective realities. What we've got is a real subjective problem, because the subjective problem is in the black community, and righteously so, are in opposition to most racism in the country, and that makes black people suspect white people, in fundamental ways that aren't often recognized. On the other hand, the same thing is true with women, and students are now coming out of not any history of struggle. It's a spontaneous movement, so there's no ideology, there's no guiding sense of strategy, there's no orientation that makes, say, socialism a real policy. People say they're anti-capitalist, they don't even know what the hell that means, and so on. So we're really at a moment See, in the past, we had models of socialism. I mean, when we came through in the 60s and so on, as some of you all know, there was China, there was Vietnam, there was Cuba. You don't have that now. And so we really got an interesting moment of what are we going to do. Now, okay, the last point I want to make about the Southern Workers Assembly is we've got two strategic goals that we're calling. One is higher levels of consciousness, and the other is coordinated collective action. And I can run that down a little bit more, but I want to talk about my own work in relationship to these 4 books that you see on display here. Capitalism, and this is different things. On the left here, these 3 titles, the Meatpacking Pamphlet, the Capitalism Pamphlet, and the 3 Ways Pamphlet, are the kind of political education material that we're creating that is being read and studied in the Southern Workers Assembly. The 3 waves really reflect our trying to understand the relationship between spontaneous movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the Students Against Israeli Genocide, spontaneity, and what we're calling cadre development. That is, in the context of these movements, individuals emerge that become staff, that become leaders, that become thinkers, that become people who accept a discipline to their lives in a strategic way. And then, of course, the question is, the third stage is, what organizational development does that lead to? And what kind of transformation is possible under the historical circumstances that people find themselves in? So what this is about helping to develop that spontaneous struggle against the kind of Trumpism. And when I say Trumpism, remember, Trump is really a symbol. What we're talking about is people who are way more serious than Trump, who are not going to say drink bleach or talk about alternative facts, crazy stuff. We're talking about serious enemies that plan to rule forever and plan to have serious collateral damage and will in fact use nuclear weapons again. So we're really at a moment here. One of the interesting things is the whole question of history. One of the things that is happening in the United States is that, in particularly places like Texas and Florida, but it really is all over the country, and that is to rewrite history, restructure curriculum. So it's okay to talk about Rosa Parks, but don't mention that she was Black. In other words, it's what we thought in the 60s. If we don't do something, he will be the Count of Basie and the Duke of Ellington. In other words, what is in fact the narrative, the grand narrative of Black history, which is freedom, which is struggle. And so what we're trying to do is to write that history. So this last book, New Philadelphia, is an example of a historical work that has to do with a particular family that we say represents the 7 ways to freedom. They ran, they helped others run. They fought a town, a land, and they lived free. These 7 ways to freedom are really a description of my family. So Frank and Lucy McWhorter in the 1830s created a town, the first African Americans to legally plat and create a town in the United States that became a national park in 2022. And so this is really an abolitionist village and an abolitionist story of freedom. But what we're trying to argue here is that New Philadelphia used to be a family story. Now it's a national story. And we think about all the people on the Underground Railroad that came through there who don't even know it in their family history. So it's not about me or our family. It's really about a theme that embraces the Black experience, because the freedom narrative is a profound narrative, as you all know. It's sort of like that old Ethiopian proverb, when the master walks by, the peasant bows and silently farts. That's part of the freedom struggle. Resistance. And so what we're trying to do is to talk about resistance. And so that struggle in Black studies is really about higher levels of consciousness. It's really about how do you resist in ways that carry you through the hard and bad times, and prepare for the good times. Because as I was trying to say earlier, a lot of people are disoriented right now and really feel bad, and we've got to find a way to have conversations that remind us that we've been down before and we got up, and we're going to get up again. Trump's going to be reelected again and again in new guises unless we prepare to do something about it. And we think the contradictions in the United States are going to develop and polarities are going to develop that give us a new opportunity to struggle. So bookstores, publications, movements, transgenerational conversations are essential. Anyway, I'll stop there and we can talk about it.
So can we start discussion and comments and questions?
Yes.
Thank you, Honourable. So nice to meet you in the flesh. My name's Valerie. I'm an educator and a campaigner. Recently got elected in 2021 to local government. So I'm really into politics, but I didn't say come through family. I just for passion, etc. I went to the States to campaign, and I was in Philadelphia, and everything you've kind of spoken about has kind of resonated with me. And I was just wondering, in terms of, you talked about there being different guises of Trump coming through. I'm just thinking, on the Democrat side though, what other guises might be coming through that were to kind of challenge the kinds of things like the pushback on erasing our histories in terms of the Black struggle, or even just racism in general. So I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on that, because what I felt on the ground out there is that people felt that there was two sides, but they had the same face, and they didn't feel that there was anything specific for them and their struggle. So I'm just wondering what you think about, just going forward, how we try to counter Trumpism.
Yeah. It's really an interesting, the United States is a big place. There's lots of towns and different possibilities. One of the things that happened is that there was an election of Black mayors. And some of these mayors were people that came out of a radical background. So Chokwe Mumba of the Republic of New Africa, for instance, was elected mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. Ras Baraka, Amiri Baraka's son, was elected mayor of Newark, New Jersey. And so there were those possibilities. But when you're elected mayor, for example, of Newark, New Jersey, it's a majority Black city with international headquarters of corporations there, global airport and port. So the mayor is not in control of Newark. It's sort of a situation. And so he is now, like a lot of people that get elected, part of an electoral process that then gets delinked from any mass base. And if you intend to be reelected, then you become part of the Democratic Party and increasingly become part of the system. Chokwe Lumumba, in the same way. If you remember, the Republic of New Africa was founded in Detroit. And then they moved to Jackson and declared that it was the Republic of New Africa. And people in Mississippi, were saying, say what? We're here, we've been fighting, etc. We don't just automatically accept. So there was this contradiction between the people from Detroit and the local people. And it was really the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that was the legacy of progressive politics in Mississippi, but there was a disorientation there. So part of what's happened is that there are these momentary breakthroughs in an election, an individual, but divorced from any base that could, in fact, have some sustaining impact on the politics of the local situation. On the other hand, younger people are getting involved in electoral politics in some places, like Chicago, for instance. There's sort of a left caucus in the city council of 50 members, and there are about 8 or 9 people representing kind of a left caucus. But again, urban politics in the United States is hardball. And so there are other kinds of contradictions. For example, Harold Washington, who was the first black mayor of Chicago, represented the emergence of black political power. Today, the Latino population, sort of both Puerto Rican and Mexican, are asserting themselves. And so black middle class is not willing to accept the possibility that it's their turn, which is really similar to what had happened in Chicago of the Irish and the Polish struggling. And so the consolidation of progressive politics is weaker today than it had been in the past. And so it has to evolve to where we have new leadership that understands this contradiction between black and Latino. The history of the assertion of working class politics is important. Recently, and I'm talking about in the last 30 years, there's been a development of a labor party, an alternative to the left of the Democratic Party. But the problem in that was that the main unions were supportive of the Labor Party up to the possibility of challenging the Democratic Party in the electoral politics. They weren't for that. And they were funding the development of the Labor Party. So that didn't happen. But now we're talking again about what are the possibilities of the two alternatives that have always been there. Transforming the Democratic Party from within, or creating an alternative in some kind of critical election that would replace them. And remember, if you don't have a movement, you need a lot of money. And that has been why the trade unions, who have a lot of money, have been so critical in determining what happens. And that's why in developing the idea of a workers' movement, not a trade union movement, is so important. Because the question is, how do you impact the policies of the trade union movement? And so we're really, that's why the South is so important, because we're really outside of see, the way it works in the United States is coming out of the Depression, et cetera, there's a law that created the National Labor Relations, NLRB, board. This government body is set up to manage the development of trade unions. So the way it works is you get a certain number of workers to sign cards saying they want a union election, and then you have an election. And that election has to be a majority vote for the workers to want a union. And of course, that means the company organizes a great campaign to stop that. we're talking about a workers' movement that's not contingent upon NLRB elections, that are based on the struggle, so that if, for example, there are places where you can have 40% of the workers vote for a union and then feel like they failed, and depression and demoralization sets in, and that's the end of it. As opposed to recognizing 40%, that's one hell of a base in that plant, in that industry to build on. It's the same as the electoral politics. There's a Ujima party in Baltimore, Maryland. The brother ran for city council, got 1,000 votes, but didn't get elected. And we were meeting and he complained that he had failed. And I said, well, how many emails did you collect of those 1,000 people? You all have meetings and there's 25 people in the room. You had 1,000 people vote for you. That's a hell of a step forward. Maybe next time you can get 2,000. But don't think of it as a failure. And so there's again, it's a question of who's summing up these processes of experience so that people can always have a positive view and not a negative view. Because a negative view is part of the plan. It's a disorientation. See, we say, you know that old slogan, fight, fail again, fight on to victory. We never fail if we sum up and learn the lessons of our experience. And then we can fight again and do better. So that's why we write those pamphlets. And that's why you ought to buy those pamphlets. But the other thing is that, well, let me not go on the other thing. There's other questions. Yeah.
I've got so many questions I could ask. I mean, just on the international analysis you gave, you didn't mention the environmental challenge and the global south. That's going to be huge because there's this kind of consensus on the green stuff that really end of interest to black people wherever they are. But actually, it's huge in terms of how it's going to impact the Caribbean,
No question.
Africa. But the other question I wanted, because you touched on it, is that I'm also an elected politician. I have to admit that. Cool. I left the Labour Party of Gaza. Personally, I don't see any hope in terms of the Labour Party ever being a source of any kind of progressive agenda. And frankly, I've got too many chips on my shoulder, and I had too many people very close to me who were violated by the Labour Party. So on a personal level, those bridges are totally burnt for me. But just in terms of your view on the American situation, in the Democratic Party, out the Democratic Party, or both, what's your kind of analysis on that? And what can we learn from that over here?
Yeah. I think the part of the problem in the United States is that people are based in the Democratic Party. And so to think about an alternative is a question of how do you get there? And the way we're talking about it is developing a workers' program and using that program to inside the Democratic Party, but inside the Republican Party and everywhere else, in order to begin to create the consciousness of an alternative. Because there's a struggle of legitimacy in the political arena. The McCarthyism history of being against the left is really powerful in the United States. And so people are set up to hear certain words, you know what I mean, and they react. So we have to really figure out a workers' program that can speak directly to the material interests of people, this alienated 1/3 of the electorate, as well as the base across the board, and the majority of people in the country, but the base, and use that to expose the all of the political tendencies toward the creation of a new political tendency. And but in any given context, in the short run, that might mean gains calling themselves Democrats. In other words, when AOC was elected, that was a positive thing. She maybe is part of the Democratic Party now. But at that moment, so the question isn't her as much as what happened in the base. And what capacity do we have to be part of that base and organizing it so that it can become independent of the Democrat Party as such? So it's a question of the strategy to develop an alternative requires multiple tactics, again, depending on where you are. Remember, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was an alternative to the Democratic Party in Mississippi because they were exclusionary. Then they had to confront the National Party at the convention, and they were rejected. I was there, you know. And then when they went back, the alternative was to build a new Democratic set of candidates to run for sheriff and mayor and city council and so on. So the progress of the civil rights movement in Mississippi created a new sort of local base of the Democratic Party. But there was no other movement that could take that somewhere other than being under the auspices of the National Democratic Party and that wing of Capitol. And so what we've got to do is we've got to figure out how to create this workers' program. I mean, the masses of people in the United States want universal health care. They want clean environment, clean water. The United States doesn't have clean water. I don't know what the water's like in, I think we mentioned something about water.
Not much better.
So that's how I would answer the question. In other words, it's the program and the strategy that then has to take us through multiple tactics. And I suspect the same is true here. Different places, you know, because we're talking about leadership, we're talking about sustainability. These are rough questions. See, we didn't understand that. Let me just finish this one sentence. We didn't understand that. We thought the 60s was the new normal. We didn't understand the long distance run. And so stuff has happened that really has blindsided us. And what the hell is going on now? I mean, you know, Trump, you know, I mean, that nobody anticipated that. So, but we do have to be clear about strategy and tactics. That's my point. Sorry. Yeah.
Once you're on this subject, I mean, you have the same problem here as in the USA. The question of electoral reform, because you have a duopoly system where you have the two-party system, and you need to have electoral reform with proportional representation so that people vote matters, so people votes count, because you cannot have the whole system with the electoral college where it boils down to what, yes, seven so-called critical states or whatever it is. How can you move forward when you sort of locked into that system that does not allow for proper representation of people's vote, and you have a sort of sham democracy? Like here, you know, the first past the post system is awful, right? So that, you know, you outside of the realm of getting struggling for electoral reform to actually make sure that people you have a wider views of representation around the table.
Yeah. See, the United States, all these bourgeois democracies, you have to really examine what the word democracy means. So in the United States Senate, a tiny little state like Rhode Island has 2 senators. A state like Wyoming, few people, 2 senators. A state like New York or California, a lot of people, big states, 2 senators each. So that's called democracy. It's certainly not representative of the population, but it has to do with the particular political history of the country. And so I think you're right that we have to have a vision of a new kind of democracy. We have to have a vision of something beyond the structures of oppression and alienation that we face. But at the same time, that's true as a strategy. The question is, what are the immediate steps we have to take now? Now, the question you raise about the environment is, I mean, clearly is very important. The interesting thing about the United States is that capital and the privileged classes have, for example, privileged living on the coasts and privileged living on fill-in land, as if the ocean, is you could fill it in. In fact, in New York, they're actually trying to build a wall around Lower Manhattan to stop the ocean. So we're at a moment where capital is again prepared to have a lot of collateral damage. And, the future of environmental disaster is beyond what most people are prepared to understand. And it involves every aspect of the environment. So we really, again, have to think about a strategy of saving the planet, but figuring out how do we get there if, in fact, the main aspects of capital are prepared. I mean, they're investigating other planets. You know what I mean? I mean, we're in a serious moment here. But ideologically, the masses of people are actually prepared to accept shorter lives because of the possibility of the levels of consumption that they've got now. Gym shoes, fast foods, a lot of clothes, closets full, no matter how much money you make it. Poor people got more than one TV in the house. They're prepared. And so, again, it's a crisis over what is civilization? What is culture? I mean, these are so fundamental, and it's hard sometimes to talk about it at this level because what frame of reference do we have, to actually realize that life itself is endangered, and so it's conversations like this and it's sharing and constantly talking. I mean, we just came from a little health retreat, my wife and I. And we're trying to figure out how to be healthy. And when you start thinking about that, you realize we live in a sea of poison. I mean, it's hard to, and we all have pleasure from that very poison. All of us. I mean, it's not just them, it's all of us that participate in this mess that we're in. And the interesting thing about the United States is that a lot of people in the world still think the United States is an alternative. They still have it as a value. And the truth be told, some of us in the United States have England as a value. So, it's a deep situation. Gus.
I understand the logic of proportional representation. But I don't think it gives us the vision that we need in terms of democratic participation and active citizenship and the rest. As you were speaking, I recalled some developments here which are pretty parallel to what you were talking about. And it was interesting to read about the workers' committees and how that's been developing and so on. Because it seems to me that there's a fundamental problem, which is why I have my doubts about what proportional representation would deliver. Okay, so we came here from the colonies, and we have been used to workers' struggles and worker organization in those parts. We brought that experience with us, experience of organizing, experience of struggle experience of resistance, right? And then we found ourselves immersed in this mini two-party system, each resembling the other more and more as time passes. But our reality, our existential reality was that we were not just organizing around health and safety at work, wages, working hours, etc. We were doing all of that within the trade union movement, but we also had other stuff to contend with. Police bashing you on the streets, your children being disproportionately stopped and searched, no dogs, no Irish, no blacks when you try to find accommodation and so on. So our struggles as workers were taking place inexorably in every area of our lives, and not just in the workplace.
Yeah.
The trade union movement, on the other hand, continued to organize in the workplace and around issues to do with labor and all of that stuff, but refused to confront not only the racism that we had to suffer in terms of education and police and so on and so forth, but the racism within their own ranks. Right? So my question is this: how is it possible for workers to organize themselves independently of these historical institutions, such that the institutions have got to take a look at themselves and their relevance because of the power of what workers are actually doing? That's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is this, and let me use an example. From about 1997, after Tony Blair was elected and Labour came out of the Thatcher wilderness, there was the move towards depleting the power of elected local authorities, local government, much more centralism from the center, from government, and giving more powers to basically the private sector to organize health and education and so on and so forth. So whereas we had before local education committees in Manchester, in London, and wherever, who were responsible for making provision for schooling and ensuring that all children, irrespective of their abilities, got their entitlement to education, that function was handed over to carpet magnates and car dealerships and God knows all kinds of wretched people who know sweet bugger all about education. Okay? And that is what we have. So, and what I still can't understand is how, given the history of the development of compulsory schooling and of free education in the country, how we, the people, allowed the government to impose that system upon us, of these academies not run by elected representatives, a complete and utter democratic displacement, not just a deficit, is totally erased, right? But then that suited the middle classes to a huge extent, and they were also happy to have the second tier system of education going on, so that those academies, etc., that exclude children hand over fist, excluding more than any other period where maintained schools were excluding kids, those children get sent to something called pupil referral units, or more broadly, alternative provision. But the issue is this: the very schools, the very academy trusts that are actually being empowered and encouraged by government to exclude those children are the ones whom the government is paying to set up alternative provision for those they exclude. So they're screwing the system twice over. They're capitalizing on the misery that those children are suffering and on the denial of the fundamental human rights. And we just getting on with it. Yeah? So I think that's one of the examples of what I'm talking about. How is it possible for the nation to allow that sort of thing to happen? Which brings me, and I'm finishing in a minute, which brings me to the issue of the United States. I have a conference bag here from the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. United States based. It's got a membership of about 5,000. Coventry University, where I worked until 2023, was the only non-US institution that was affiliated to them. And I used to go to the conferences representing Coventry University. They are in dire straits because all over the place now, people are outlawing DEI, as they call it. Here we call it EDI, DEI. And so many of these diversity officers in higher education are having their contracts annulled, and they're losing their jobs, and the whole institution, the whole organization is in crisis. And what's been going on in my mind is, I go to these conferences, Florida, Washington, wherever, and the place is full, 4,000 people, members. And I can't understand how, given what brought them to their jobs in the first place, and the movement that there has been in terms of the number of black people getting positions, not just in EDI or DEI, but across faculties, etc. How is it possible for there to be such a movement to abolish DEI, not just across the HE sector, but in the society more generally? I mean, and not just Trump, but Biden and the whole of the world were about doing the same thing. So it suggests to me that although in many respects there have been many advances, these threats to our freedoms, to the results of our organization and struggle, are not only real, they are becoming the new normal.
Yeah, many different important points you've raised, Gus. I think we were not good sociologists. We didn't understand that to enter into an organized bureaucracy, you were going to adapt to the institutional norms over time. Mm-hmm. And so the people who were radical moved into an organized system, a university, a government post, wherever. And suddenly your interaction with other people normed you. Acceptable language and orientation. And also the question of your individual tactics. What were you trying to accomplish? Because what happened is that people saw this conservative institution that was essentially organized against your main interests. And so then you had to decide what particular reforms, what particular goals you could have, since politics is the art of the possible. Revolutionaries, it's the art of the impossible. But the art of the possible is, this week, this month, this year, this session of whatever body you're part of. And so that becomes a conservatizing process. What I've been trying to say is that the polarity of the new politics that are emerging in the United States is going to produce a negation of that. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking to have a new radicalization of a wing of the black middle class. That's going to be very important because that's where a lot of leadership is going to come from. Right. And it's going to be the strength of the new movement. It's also going to be the weakness of the new movement, because that new movement will take advantage of that first wave of leaders, but its sustainability is going to be based on what leaders can actually come from the working class and represent the interests of the working class. Mm-hmm. Now, the first point you made about the limitations of trade unions that are only focused on the workplace and immediate economic demands, very important. There's this whole concept in the United States of social justice unionism, which is the idea that trade unions have this broader interest. So part of it is the unemployed workers. Mm-hmm. Part of it is all the social conditions under which you go into when you're family, et cetera, is the orientation, and not just workplace. What I was trying to get at earlier with regard to the Black liberation movement, the women's movement, the student movement, is right now we're in a debate over this general strike call for 2028. Mm-hmm. The contracts that will be then negotiated are plant by plant, industry by industry. But a general strike would actually move it from the economic realm to the political realm. And so we're talking about Congress. And so the question is whether or not these broader social movements are going to be mobilized and organized enough to interact with the trade union movement to develop a broader workers' program that will, in fact, challenge the state over universal health care, over the issues that are inherent in a workers' program. This includes the environmental issues. This includes the whole question of not just insurance, et cetera, but the development of healthcare facilities, which have been essentially removed from small towns, et cetera, clinics. I mean, it's really incredible situation. But so that's a strategy. Now, there are 4 years to go. So what's actually going to happen to build that? And so the whole question of propaganda, the whole question of agitation, the whole question of educational opportunities, what it raises is this whole question of self-determination. See, we've got women, for example, that whine about the fact that men, are unsympathetic to the demands of women's movement. And our response is women have to organize. Maybe men won't be who you want them to be. So what? Women have to organize. Same thing is true with black people. A lot of black people think white people are supposed to free them. That's what it comes down to. And the reality is black people have to organize. Some people think school boards or teachers, you have to organize. That's happened before. It's only when you self-organize that you have then a basis for transforming the society. Sure. Give me a place to stand and I can move the world. Well, where are you going to stand? That's what it comes down to. We are the problem is the point I'm trying to make here. We are the problem. Because as soon as you say they are the problem, then you're stuck. You ain't going to change Trump. So what are you going to do? You better change yourself and your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues. That's the basis. And the interesting thing about the working class in the United States is it's institutionalized ignorance. People just don't know stuff, and don't believe stuff. And their heads are stuck in the TV and they believe what they see there. And our position is everything, if it's on TV, it's a lie. Don't believe it. You'd be better off. I missed some things, but hey, So Gus, self-determination, that's the key. That's really the power of the history of New Beacon. In other words, this is a belligerent stand against all the forces that are, supposed to you're not supposed to have this. You're not supposed to read these books. You know, you're supposed to watch TV and go to the movies. You know, you're supposed to think the Black Panthers are in Wakanda. You know.
Well,
Yeah.
Great.
I'm hoping you'll continue a discussion on the strategy. One of our late comrades used to say, don't agonize, organize.
Yeah.
You mentioned three component parts of that potential movement in terms of Black Lives Matter, women, students. But at the end of the last century, the projection was that the Latino population would be increasing at a tremendous rate, that the white population, those who consider themselves white, would only be 15% of the total populace of the US. Now, knowing that this Latino population was therefore going to become extra significant, what was the movement building that was going on to incorporate that force with the other movements that were already established?
Yeah, no, it's a very important question, and what we're also dealing with here is levels of understanding of this phenomenon. So, for example, the word Latino or Latinx, etc., is a way of having an umbrella over all these different nationalities. That was one of the problems in the Harold Washington administration. People wanted to have policies that were open to the Latino population, and people had to go in and say, Harold, they're all Puerto Ricans. You need some Mexicans. You know, I mean, I mean, one way to look at it is the language question. You know, so this whole question of how to legitimize Spanish as part of the lingua franca of the country. The history of the United States is that at a certain point in time, a large percentage of the schools in places like Indiana, et cetera, were in German. So there's been a diverse language policy historically in the United States. And so this English only is really just part of that racist, Eurocentric negation of the reality of the Americas. I think also the interesting thing about the Latino populations, all of the populations, is their connection to countries of origin and the movements in those countries of origin. That's had a positive effect on some of the thinking of younger people. This is true in the realms of culture. It's true in the realms of politics. So there's an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial possibility in their thinking. And that's very positive. But see, a lot of Black people are caught up in the same sense of the Americas. You coming up here, you wetbacks are coming up in here, you're taking our jobs, you know, et cetera. So there's that level of hostility. But that is something that really can be fought, because the economic reality is that this crisis affects people of all these different nationalities. And so that's in other words, it's a class perspective that cuts through the national Eurocentric, you know, because a lot of Black people, I tell you, you know, if you're not a nationalist, you could be very Eurocentric and think just like the people who are, you know, racism can affect you.
Same here.
You know, and so, but the last thing I want to say is that we also have to include other interests like the LGBTQ interests. You know, in other words, there are various sectors of the population that are being attacked and being isolated, and a lot of people agree. You know, in other words, you're being attacked, but you agree with them being attacked. And so it's really important for us to figure out how to talk about pain and suffering across all these different groups. I usually talk about it in terms of the dentist's office, because everybody in the dentist's office is holding their jaw, you know, and I'm arguing against the hierarchies of pain. You know, where Black people sometimes say, well, we're the ones that got the worst problem. But then you look at the Native Americans, they got them still on reservations. And, you know, they're not going to say, yes, Black people have it worse than us. You know, so you can't have a hierarchy of pain. So somebody goes in the dentist's office and say, my jaw really hurts. I'd like to go next. but set your butt down and take a number. You know what I mean? We're all in here for the same reason. So we have to figure out how to get past that hierarchy of pain and get to the point where we're talking about the unification of people who are all suffering from the same system. And it's that level of understanding we have to get to. You know, and
I just want to say, of the
Yeah.
Latinx communities, there's also a strong tradition on the right. So you look at the Cuban expats, you look at the Nicaraguan Contras who brought crack cocaine in with the CIA to America, right? That's not a conspiracy theory, actually. That's, recognized journalists who brought that, under George Bush, absolutely. So, because my understanding was that vote was quite split in terms for Trump. I just think there's a regressive history there as well for some of those communities. So.
But how do you my problem is trying to understand terminology in America, because anything that appears on the fringe seems to be classified as left, right? Everybody, I mean, here, if you just say people should have a affordable living wage, you're called a communist. They're what they call friend now. Everything is being classified on the left, and you're saying, well, what is the so-called left in America? What is the so-called left? Who, Kamala Harris was the left. Anybody who say anything that is not part of the norm is left. I mean, what's her name? The leader of the Green Party, she must be really ultra left. Is Jill Stein? Is this Jill Stein or whatever her name is? The one who the Democrats organized to get off the presidential role in New York. So how does the quote unquote left find a clear ideological path and say, well, look, this is where we're headed?
see the anti-communism of the global capitalist reality that we face expresses itself in different language. You know, I mean, there are people who could call yourself a socialist and still be on the right. But what we're talking about is a workers' program. What that means is, can we construct language that connects to the material interests of people? And that's the connection. So that these ideological, pejorative references to the left become irrelevant. Think about Sanders and the levels of votes that he got because he was putting forward a program that was closer to the actual material needs of people. Now, of course, he was called the left, and Kamala Harris was called the left. And they have very different policies. And he had to be stopped. And he was stopped by the black middle class in South Carolina. But the answer, and see, we have to really think about people, average people, who sit down with their families and try to have a meal and try to take care of their kids and try to take care of their house and maybe are interested in taking care of their parents as they grow older. They're material interests. And people can have all kind of confused ideas about religion and about politics and about culture, etc. But those interests are what anchor them in reality. And so politics of the future that we have to build have to connect with those interests and help people understand those interests and then fight for those interests. In the South, Black Workers for Justice, an organization in North Carolina, connected with racist, that is subjective racists in workplaces, when in fact economic struggles actually brought forward their interests and black workers' interests in the same way. And then people began to realize how wrong they were about certain ideas. And this has happened time and time again in different historical circumstances. But that's what we have to really focus on. People are common. They're the same. And they have to understand, if you keep eating this way, you're going to die. And it's structured. So that if you eat this way, you're going to have certain kind of medical care, and you're going to have to buy these pharmaceuticals. And it's all one system. And so part of our politics is also how do we liberate ourselves from the conditions of subservience to the capitalist crisis that we're all engaged in. We're part of it. That includes culture. They can put some shit on you through some songs. Look, Ice-T, what did he say? Fuck the police. They turned him into the police on TV. They pimped him right in front of everybody. They would put your mama on the street. I mean, that's how cold-blooded it is. And it's happening to all of us. And so we're living in the science fiction world that we have to now speak the truth about. And it's going to increasingly be dangerous. You know. And so we got to stand up. New Beacon. You know, because they're already attacking New Beacon. More attacks are coming. But we are the majority. And so we got to figure out single spark can start a prairie fire. A little bit of something can begin to wake up people. It's going to get worse, but it might be the dark before the dawn. That's all I'm trying to say.
Abdul, I've just got a quick question on the electorate. So it's just around the vote turnout. So you mentioned obviously that the turnout this time I think was the lowest since, well, it was low in 2016, low in 2020. Very similar to Brexit. So in the UK, I think for the EU referendum, the vote turnout was very low. And it was said at the time it was because people weren't sure what they were voting for. What do you think are the main reasons for people choosing not to vote? Is it a rejection of both candidates, or is it being unclear of, or not being unsure of making the right or the wrong decision?
I think, first of all, people are alienated from the political process in the sense that they don't see any of these people actually meeting their needs. So they're alienated. In other words, they're separate from the possibility that it will improve their lives. I think it's also a question of the way in which the population is demobilized. So it's not just alienated, it's demobilized. You know, like there's a certain percentage of those people who couldn't get to vote. They weren't getting a ride to the polls. They weren't. I think the young people who had been one of the greatest sources of non-voters are beginning to wake up. But that's still not entirely the case. I also think that there were organized efforts to stop people from voting. So that, for example, limiting the number of polling places, limiting the number of hours in access, creating problems of identification. You know, are you registered? And eliminating people. So there were a lot of shenanigans in that way as well. But I think the main thing is these social movements. If we can figure out how to confront this alienation of people, because I'm telling you, black people, that moment of Obama was, led to a great alienation, because Obama didn't deliver. In fact, he said, I didn't even promise to deliver. And so there was this euphoria among the middle classes about Harris, but, it wasn't the same. Done that, it was much more a question of Bernie Sanders that represented some real possibilities because he was at least addressing the working class, whereas Harris, for example, ended up trying to seduce a section of the Republicans and the suburban women that ended up still voting for Trump, which was shocking to people. But we're
who will it be shocking to? America is not a post-racial society. Full stop. I mean, I read all the projections and all this sort of thing, and the reality is that America is not a post-racial society.
Well, I'm not sure there is a post-racial society in the world.
So this illusion that people will sort of foster in their minds. And,
See, part of the way idealism works is that you can feel good about an idealism that is not connected to the material reality in which you live. So that the symbols that are manipulated in the society really capture people at various times and in various ways. I mean, right now, for example, you know what one of the hottest things in higher education is? The fact that Yale University is offering a course on Beyonce. You know, what? You know, they ain't had no course on Muddy Waters and the Blues or Train, you know. So this is all part of the make-believe manufacturing of consent, the way in which the society is controlling the subjective understanding of the world. And that's where self-determination has to come in. And we have to have language and we have to have intent, you know, that is really cutting through that. That's why we need cadre. That's why we need people to study. That's why we need to self-organize. And if we don't do that, then we're going to start to be mobile, you know, mourning and, you know, sobbing about this and that. We have to be our own liberators. I mean, that, you know, y'all have heard that before. You know, it remains true.
Part of one of the biggest problems we face is our kids. I'm talking, look, we have, like the New Beacon. When we were growing up, we devoured a lot of these books, right? We read. The whole internet experience has encouraged a lot of laziness now. They don't want to read anything. Everything is, it must, you know, if they can't get it in 5 minutes, it's not, you know. I was trying to get my children just to read books, get information, go and find information. That's what we used to have to do. Because we didn't have the internet, we didn't have, you know, we have to go in the library in some of the dark corners where they hide away all the books on all the progressive literature. When we grew up in an area and they had sedition laws.
But wait a minute. There are people here who haven't said a word. What do you think? That brother sitting right there.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about Trump, and I'm thinking about, excuse me, the influence that he's having on us in terms of the way that our politics is changing. So, the point that you made about Trumpism in terms of somebody else is going to come and he's going to be just like him. We're having the same thing over here with Nigel Farage, and I'm worried about what's going to happen next in terms of if Labour doesn't change. Is, you know, are we creating an environment whereby reform are going to get in, and what's going to happen then? We're going to be marginalised even more. You know, so people are being educated, or people are, what's the word? People are voting based on very few issues, and the biggest issue that people supposedly think about now is immigration. So you look on, you listen to the radio, and all they're talking about is immigration, and they're marginalising us as a community.
Well, that's not just here.
And
I mean,
have one
that's
simple
everywhere.
answer.
What about this sister right here?
We are here because you
I was just thinking sort of about people linking into Trump. Good news today is that Kemi Badenoch has recognized that she's black.
Oh, she recognised she was working class just the other day.
Because she said, this is the new leader of the Tory party, she said that when she came from a middle-class Nigerian family. When she came here, she became working class.
She worked.
I only worked at McDonald's.
Because she worked at McDonald's, that's right. So today, apparently, Starmer made a joke about her because he was at the the film
studios.
studio, I can't remember the name. And so he started off by saying that, as Karen Radenoff said, that because she worked in McDonald's, she'd become working class. If he kept coming to the Pinewood, he would become James Bond. So Karen Radenoff was speaking about in America, and she was, complaining that it's because she's black that Starmer was saying that about her. So
She likes it both ways, isn't it?
she suddenly found out.
Okay. What do you think?
Me.
Yes.
I've really enjoyed listening to you tonight. I've learnt so much from you, and there's so many things I'm trying to process everything you said. But a few things that have really struck me from what you're saying is that the concept of self-organise, that really struck me. And I think it's really, really important to understand history, because you said that before, there's some people think that you don't need to know. But I think in order to understand where we're going, we need to know where we've come from or what struggles people have gone through. So that really resonated with me as well, about the education as well. And I think there's a lot of erasure going on as well. I grew up for a long time, I don't often share this, but I moved to Ireland when I was 11. We didn't have a TV for 5 years, so I didn't know what was going on at all. So at school they'd be talking about, and I wouldn't have a clue. And from that very time, I don't really follow what's on TV, because most of it's rubbish. I'm a celebrity who I just think, and I think unfortunately a lot of people are getting brainwashed to be consumed with all this material nonsense that doesn't, it's just vacuous, isn't it? There's no meaning to it, there's no substance. So I think the phones, I try and, this is my daughter here, I try and get her to read as well, even just turning a page. That's why I love coming into bookshops, just the physical art of turning a page and actually just picking up a book and reading it. I think we've lost so much of that. And I think you mentioned that, the gentleman at the back mentioned that as well. So I just think and hopefully we'll get back to some sort of normality, whatever normality is now. That's hard to figure out what that is as well. I could talk a lot, but there's just certain things that I'm really picking up from what you're saying.
With this point about not knowing history, I mean, there's a serious point I'm making about Kerry Badenoch. We've got these black and brown people who are in prominent positions in the increasingly right-wing party. And, this is supposed to be the wonders of diversity.
So it's not just Kenny, it's Lammy as well.
Yeah, all of them.
He said one thing one day.
You'll find out about Lammy. Go to
Okay, well, let me ask her daughter, what would you like to say?
Yeah, thank you, Mum. I mean, like, I was definitely trying to listen to him, like, everything he was saying. I was also trying to process all the information. I think I was able to follow fairly well. I've definitely going to be able to listen to a lot of the ideas around this room. What's worrying me right now, is like, have people already noticed how like massive the far right's grown? I mean, it's always been here, but like recently, it's like had a massive surge, especially in Europe, with I think Le Pen in like France, and identitarianism in Germany. You've seen it everywhere. Poland, Russia. There's so many like different so many different neo-Nazi groups, so many fascist groups everywhere. But again, I feel like what's happening right now, especially because we're in the age of like consumerism. We're in like not even like late stage capitalism, almost end stage capitalism. Doesn't feel like anything is actually working anymore. I mean, all these celebrities are all trying to pretend to be people, but no one's falling for any of this stuff anymore. We're still like we're aware of the society we're living in, but like, I feel like a lot of people. First of all, I mean, we've due to what was it again? Thing in the 80s. Basically, we've had the erasure of third spaces, and I mean that's been the thing that's been going on for a very long time. But again, okay,
my daughter could talk a lot because she loves politics.
It's interesting.
Just maybe finish because
also because I'm not saying. But again, because we're living in such like a confusing age, like there's also we're living in an age where I mean we've always lived in this age where people don't realize that like two things can happen at once. Like genocide is still happening. That hasn't stopped happening just because we moved on to the next conversation. Again, all this stuff still exists in this world. I mean, also because people sometimes think that just like knowing certain information is good enough instead of actually organising to like help spread awareness of that information, or maybe even protesting in real life to hopefully stop it.
Thanks, Rachel. She was about to stop her.
Good. It's so
She's very passionate about politics.
Sure.
Thank you for letting her have a chance to speak. Thank you.
Oh, neoliberalism, that sort of thing.
Neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, what about this brother right here?
Thank you for your discussion. It's absolutely amazing. Can I ask the fact that we have to mobilise as Black people globally? What's the relationship between mobilisation and the fact that Black people intellectually and historically have had multiple ideologies of Pan-Africanism, nationalism, socialism, Marxism? What's the relationship to mobilise people, and yet we've had in our intellectual history different divergent views? How do we get it? I mean, what do you suggest is the best ideology to mobilise us and to see things through our political own epistemology? That's
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think that we have to make a distinction between sort of the analytical definitions of these ideologies, which can in fact separate them from each other. But when you actually study history, what you find is the convergence of many of these ideas that are part of the historical moment of any given struggle, any given part of the world. So if you look at Africa, for instance, nationalism, Pan-Africanism, socialism, there is no African leader in the anti-colonial struggle, etc., that wasn't dealing with all of that. That even includes Kenyatta. You know, now he wasn't, Oginga Odinga, he wasn't certain people, but he was struggling to try to figure out how to bring those things together. My next book is going to be an argument against what are called the canons of Black intellectual history. The word canon is often referred to as a text, a book. So you always have people, what are the key books to read? And you give a list of books. And often these books are texts are taken out of context. Because any book is really in dialogue with the past, the current, and anticipating the future. So I want to replace the text as canon with the conference as canon, where people have come together and all of these different ideologies are in play in a conversation that's a condensed conversation over a few days. Of course, an example is the International Book Fair of Black and Radical Black and Third World Books, the Pan-African Congresses, the National Negro Convention movement from 1830 until after the Civil War, where Black people, under the conditions of slavery, were gathering in the northern states to try to figure out what to do. There were only three ways to deal with it, right? One way is to ask for a little help. Maybe y'all could lighten up a little bit. Or two, maybe we get the hell out of here and go somewhere else. Or three, we have to fight. That's always been the three options. Negotiate, leave, or fight. And, the bottom line is that any Black leader, has to deal with all of those ideologies and tendencies. I mean, so analytically, we understand them, but in the real world, there's a convergence. And so I'm back to my point about the interests. And one of the things that happens in every movement is new language develops. For that matter, even new hairstyles develop. All kinds of things develop.
So are you saying then that the perennial argument, is it race, is it class, are you saying we should see that as one convergent idea? I mean, is there...
What will unite us are closer to the reality of our lives as opposed to the games, the language games that can be played. One of the things that happened in the United States that impacted Black studies is the postmodernism from Europe. So people then thought the way to talk about reality is to try to make up polysyllabic words and long, complex sentences, like we were speaking German or something. You know what I mean? And so academics often then ended up developing a language that they could talk to each other that was alienated from and not understood by the masses of people. You know, and so part of the connection to the struggle of activists is to, you know, what did they say when Malcolm was talking? Make it plain. You know, say it so you can understand it. Now, there's a book you may know called The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. In that book, he tells a story of a minister who was a great preacher. Everybody really loved to hear this preacher because he could tell it in a way that you could get it. You know, he could make the Bible come alive and so on. So they said, well, this guy is so great, let's send him to seminary so he could really study theology. Came back, gave a speech, gave a lecture, gave a sermon. People said, what the hell did he say? What's going on? We don't understand anything. What happened to this guy? Well, what happened to him is he was miseducated into a language that was alien and foreign to the actual experience of the people of his community. So we've got to really struggle over this. This is Ngugi's point about language. This is, you know, we have to figure out a way to actually love and communicate with our people, with ourselves. And again, it goes back to these simple realities. We are our own liberators. I mean, we went to Ferguson, you know, after the struggle developed there. And some of the young people were so, you know, angry and so oriented to the street that they developed an antagonism with the older people in the community who were saying, trying to caution them about confronting the police in the street. So we were talking about with them in a little conference with the activists of Ferguson and asking them, well, what do you see strategically? What's going to happen in Ferguson? If you win whatever it is you're fighting for, what would it turn out to be? You know, and they found it difficult to answer those questions. And, you know, we said, well, who's going to drive the buses? Who's going to deliver the mail? Who's going to teach? The very people who you are dealing with as conservatives, etc. You have to connect with them. I mean, it's the people of Ferguson who have to be transformed if Ferguson is going to be transformed. There is no other you know, Ferguson than the people who live there. Mm-hmm. So you better talk to your mama and her next door neighbor and your auntie and the person across the street and sit down and have long conversations so that you can learn from them and they can learn from you. But I went back the next year, they're still in the street confronting the police. And they're still in the street confronting the police. And, you know, eventually they get fewer and fewer people to do that because you can't just sustain that. Then this guy named Tef Poe, who was a rapper, who was one of the leaders. You know what I said about Ice-T. They actually took Tef Poe from Ferguson and made him a visiting scholar at Harvard. Wow. And he's wearing, you know, he's doing ghetto fabulous. He's wearing chains and he's, you know, walking around Harvard like he's, you know, and he didn't even understand that he was the new Venus Hottentot. He was on display. They were fronting him. It was a joke. You know, I mean, it's like, you know, I mean, it's beyond being upset about what happens to people. They fronted the Negro and he didn't even understand what was going on. The rapper. Mm. In fact, they have a hip hop institute at Harvard. And they've got some of these rappers like Snoop and so on giving 6- and 7-figure money to that institute because it's a tax write-off, and it's part of the deal, so they can make more money.
What I'd like to say now is just to make one comment, and then if you could
wrap
it up.
Yeah.
Part of what we do here in New Beacon is about empowerment, and this is partly what you're talking about with these books, about getting into discussions and getting into a connection with the people we need to connect with to go forward. And I'm just going to pick up on Wayne's point there about the new situation now with new technology and people not being able to read and not being willing to read. And we've got to break that cycle, that vicious circle of getting people to get information off the internet, which is really important, but going deeper with books. And I'm not necessarily saying books alone, but with other forms of information, so that this very limited level of education stops, because we need that, as you proposing in these situations. So it's just to put it into people's heads how we're going to break that circle, and how can we promote getting more information, deeper information, than just off the internet, off a screen. I just leave it open there, and if you could conclude for us.
Yeah, in conclusion, I want to ask my wife to say something before I talk.
Well, I had been bursting to say something. I think the other side of the coin of this challenge of self-organization and self-determination is a concept that they use in Cuba called the battle of ideas. And it really relates to what you just said, Michael. When we invented this project that became the Worker's Guide to Meatpacking, it was to engage in the battle of ideas by explaining what was happening in the meatpacking industry during COVID, because they were still packing meat and they weren't letting the workers go home when they were sick. But when we did the study, when we did the research into the meatpacking industry, we discovered that the meatpacking industry was full of many, many languages. There were Iranians working in the meatpacking. There were people speaking Spanish. There were white Americans working in meatpacking. And we ended up with a pamphlet that told a story from every state in the South, because we're Southern Workers Assembly. And we also ended up with a pamphlet, if you turn it around, it's in Spanish. It's not in Persian, sorry. But I think that the path to self-determination really is engaging in the battle for ideas, which can mean listening, talking, writing, purchasing a book, reading something useful on the internet, and so on. And I guess this is also a shameless plug that you should look at our example, because it was very popular, because we were working on this problem of small bites of information that people want. So we gave them a bite from every state.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's really a privilege to be able to speak at New Beacon, and because tradition and sustainability is something we should all value and fight to protect. Because what happens is that the next generation can essentially forget and be relatively isolated. And so it's really important. And I mean, I was born in 1942. I'm in my 80s. And one of the interesting things about growing old is that you want to, you know you're not going to live forever, but you want some of what you represented in your life, at least the good parts of your life, to live forever. And so it's really important to make a handoff. And I'm so glad that we were able to have this session so I could share some ideas with you, and I could confront my own lack of information and my own ignorance, because that's what happens when you talk. You realize how ignorant you actually are. And I can go back and do some more study. But anyway, thank you for being here, listening, and contributing. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.